intro as to what Archivos Subversivos is. Archivos Subversivo es una referencia a los archivos del Centro de Estudios Puertorriqueño en Nueva York. Es un archivo, es una biblioteca y es un lugar donde la gente puede ir a investigar. Okay, but to go into the archives, you can walk into a library and have access to all the books, but in order to have access to the archives, you need an appointment, you need to sit down, you need to put on special gloves to handle the documents and so on. So in 2007, I was invited to do a solo exhibition at the Centro de Estudios Puertorriqueño. And my idea for the project was, how can I showcase what's in the archivos? Okay? Por eso le pusimos documentando y divulgando historia de resistencia. Part of the very cool things that are found in that archive is, for example, the Ruth Reynolds papers. Ruth Reynolds is a woman who wrote this book, Campus in Bondage, about all the political suppression that was being experienced across the University of Puerto Rico in decades back, and the violence that student activists were facing there. She was also a librarian. She was also very good friends with Pedro Albizu Campos, and she has one of the most comprehensive collections of documents pertaining to Pedro Albizu Campos and the Nationalist Party. So this is some of the stuff that I was working with, and first I have to backtrack and say, I'm gonna have you going back and forth here. I have to go back and say that I was born and raised in Brooklyn. I was raised not to have an identity crisis, but I had one anyway. Because whether it be over there or either here, a mí me está que un puertorriqueño conoce más de Lincoln que un betance. ¿Cierto o no es cierto? Okay? There's a lot of times that our history is more within a U.S. context than it might be within a Puerto Rican context. And having grown up with that, in Brooklyn, it was very confusing for me. So everything that I had is history. My father and mother both were born in Ponce. So my father would talk to me about things related to Ponce and introduce me to Pedro Albizu Campos, not personally, I wish, but just the history. And so with these talks, there was also introduction to what Taino heritage was and what that meant. I went into my high school library and requested books on the Tainos. The book they ordered for me was a 4th grade reading level book. And so that was my first picture book de quién eran los Tainos, de que se trataba mi herencia indígena y todas esas cosas, pero un libro diseñado para un niño. Y yo tenía como 17 años queriendo tener acceso a esta información. Lo que hace esto es que cuando yo entro a la Universidad de Cornell, no dentro de los salones, no con mis profesores, empiezo un proceso de autoeducación, que es decir, entrar a la biblioteca y sacar un montón de libros sobre la historia mía. Okay? Then, to use the term subversive, I had to get subversive about it. If I had a paper due in an English class or painting due in a painting class, I would make it about my history. And that's how I killed 2 birds with 1 stone. Okay, informing myself, self-education. If I had a different assignment, if I took an African art class, then I would come out of the library with a pile. This is like before the internet really to come out with a pile of books on African art and a pile of books on Puerto Rican history. And that's how I made sense, and that's how I fully took advantage of the libraries at Cornell. So some of the things that I start responding to in my art is, who's ever seen this? Who's seen this political cartoon before? This is from 1898, called Holding His End Up. Uncle Sam, and who is he carrying? Who is he juggling? What are these figures? Is it me? Is it you? Okay, pero aquí dice Hawaii, Cuba, Philippines, Puerto Rico. Okay, this was published in the Philadelphia Inquirer in 1898 during the Spanish-American War. And so I'm finding documents such as this, I found myself responding through my art. And so one of the first things I did was a juxtaposition of this political cartoon on a Puerto Rican flag with images of my own family. And it's interesting to see this imagery because it's still like darker blues, which I changed later. These are all self-portrait, self-portrait, self-portrait. And then a play on the word colony, which is taking away letters to get from colony to Colón, as in Columbus, and from Colón removing the L to get coon. The piece is called Who You're Calling Coon, which is a derogative term used to describe African Americans, which is that caricature that you see. So image-wise, what's happening with that cartoon is that the racist derogatory images that we use to refer to African Americans are now being applied as well to all these new colonies that are being brought into the United States in 1898. So I just want to backtrack here to explain how Archivos Subversivos came about. This image, La Masacre de Ponce, is one of the things that my father talked to me about, which is a massacre that took place in 1937 in el municipio de Ponce. Creo que fallecieron 21 personas, 2 de ellos, si no me equivoco, eran policías. Pero la cuestión es que los nacionalistas no estaban armados. Sí tenían rifas, pero eran hechas de madera. O sea, era más como de show, ¿no? Y era un desfile para conmemorar no tan solo que era el Domingo de Ramos, sino estaba conmemorando también la abolición de la esclavitud. Estos dos eventos. La mayoría de las personas que asistieron eran familias, habían niños, y ahí llegó la policía y empezaron con tiroteo y resultaron estas muertes. Pues este fue uno de los eventos que papi siempre me hablaba de las cosas que sucedieron en Ponce. I had an uncle, Julio, who just passed a couple of years ago, and Julio was a little boy and was present at the Masacre de Ponce. So as part of my thesis, I created this piece, but collaged into it, I started this thing of just replacing American history, the American history I grew up with and was educated with, inserting Puerto Rican history instead. So the composition I used for this is the composition from Paul Revere's The Bloody Massacre, that's referencing the Boston Massacre of 1776. But instead, I'm using that to present my own history, cuál es la masacre de Ponce, que sucedió en Ponce en el 1937, okay? This was done in 1997. I painted it as such to reference these old documents, right? Like it's yellowing, it's glazed with ochre and stuff. And collaged underneath is a document from the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, that talked about how this indeed was a massacre because none of the nationalists were armed. 2007 is then when I'm invited to do this exhibit at the Center for Puerto Rican Studies. And just like I did at the libraries at Cornell, which was literally photocopying documents, collaging them into my paintings, because where I lived, we didn't have access to that information. When I was a graduate student in the entire New York Public Library system, that's an enormous system. You're talking about every neighborhood has a major library, Brooklyn Public Library, Queens Public Library, the New York Public Library. I found 2 branches where I could get information on this history, the subversive history of Puerto Rico. One is the Aguilar branch in East Harlem, and the other one is the Hunts Point branch in the Bronx. Pues, ¿qué hago? ¿Cuánto dinero gastamos nosotros para estudiar? Llévense la información con ustedes. ¿Cómo hacemos que en nuestra familia, toda la gente de su familia han ido al colegio, a la universidad? Todos tus hermanos han estudiado, todos tus primos, tus padres, tus tíos. Okay? How accessible is the university for all of our families and all of our communities? And in my generation, a lot of us maybe were the first, maybe in yours as well. So if you're coming out in debt, then how do you take that information with you and make it trickle down in a domino effect that could reach everybody. It's not just about you getting a job to pay your debt. It's about how you take that information back. So my idea was to go to the photocopy machine, photocopy the stuff, paste it in the painting, and now the paintings stay with me. And if I can't exhibit, then I put them up on the internet. And now you can see them there for free. And you don't have to pay how many thousands of dollars a year to study at Cornell to have access to that one document. Okay, so these are students from Hunter College viewing Archivos Subversivos. And I'm going to arrange it like this for obvious reasons. This was largely inspired el sistema del carpeteo. Okay? En Puerto Rico hubo un proceso en que el gobierno mantenía unas carpetas. ¿Y qué se encontraban en esas carpetas de estos supuestamente o llamados subversivos? What would you find in a government file of a so-called subversive? Anyone know? Yeah.
Entradas y salidas de la persona de la casa, de
Claro.
lugares, con quién hablaba, con quién no.
Claro que sí. Así de averiguado eran ellos. Yo pensaba que era documento. Yo hasta encontré un pasaje de Eastern Airlines que ni existe ya. Un pasaje de una persona que vino de Nueva York a Puerto Rico. Okay? It's exactly what you will find. Memos. This person attended this mobilization at the United Nations on this day. They arrived at 1:20 in a white car of such and such model, of such and such make, license plate such and such. This is the kind of information that we found in these files. And this was what was inspiring me when I created this project. So I'm going to start con carpeta o file Pedro Albizu Campos. And here is the piece that I created for him. Some of the things that I'll point out for each subversivo. The most amazing thing for me that I found about him, and I'll actually get very personal. This was traumatic for me because I personally, yo adoro a este señor y su legado. Fotos de Don Pedro desnudo. Muy difícil. ¿Y por qué incluía ella una foto de Don Pedro desnudo? Why were there nude photos of Don Pedro in Ruth Reynolds' files?
The lesions of his skin? Because of
The burn marks from the radiation experiments that he was subjected to as a political prisoner. Okay, full frontal photo of Don Pedro from here down, showing all of these burn marks on his skin. So that I wanted nothing to do with. I was just looking, and then here is this thing that unfortunately I had to see. I say unfortunately, but at least I didn't have to live that experience. This document is a letter written by Ruth Reynolds' organization, Americans for Puerto Rico's Independence. It's a letter written to Albert Einstein. And it's asking Albert Einstein, who was a known critic of the Un-American Committee that would put suspected subversives on trial. And they were asking him to please involve himself in the case of Don Pedro and research these atomic experiments, these nuclear experiments that were happening where people like Don Pedro had been subjected to radiation and which the United States government had been denying. And they continued to until the 1990s was when finally these findings revealed that this had been happening. By the way, as I go along, if you have questions, please chime in. That way I won't feel bad if I talk too much and then we don't end up with a lot of Q&A at the end. Yeah.
How did they expose him to radioactivity? In a cell?
Yes.
What?
What's described is that in Albizu's cell, these waves of light would come across the ceiling. And he would describe them almost like an aurora. And it's funny because the writer, Marisa Rosado, is called Las Llamas de la Aurora, and the flames of the aurora. And then consequently, one of the streets, Marina y Aurora, that's the corner in Ponce, in which that house where then the Ponce massacre took place, which is now the museum of de la Masacre de Ponce, is located. So Aurora, and one of the most beautiful things in the world, but he almost describes these rays of color just floating across the ceiling of his cell. And then the way that they would describe him feeling later is just very faint. He would sweat a lot. You know, there's this book now that describes him, Nelson Denis, War Against Puerto Ricans, describes him as the king of the towels, is what they used to call him, because he used to walk around covered in wet towels. It was the only way he could control his temperature. There was another hand.
Was Albert Einstein, did he agree with Pedro Albizu Campos, or?
Did he what? I'm sorry?
Did he agree with his ideals and stuff?
I don't know. Well, the only thing that exists is this letter, right? The only thing that exists is this letter. There's no information about the follow-up, so I don't know whatever happened. I don't know if he even knew who Don Pedro was. Although we're talking about Don Pedro, who was no era ningún cualquiera. This was a man who was, had studied biochemical engineering, who was one of the first black Harvard Law grads, spoke 7 languages, framed his entire system on the decolonization of Puerto Rico based on the Irish struggle for liberation, studied the case of India, and had also studied in biochemical engineering. He was familiar with this very technology and knew what to call it. And then folks like Luis Muñoz Marin dismissed him as having dementia, right? So this is what was happening with Don Pedro. The interesting thing about this document is at the very end, there's a PS from this American supporter of Puerto Rican independence. It says, by the way, that attack that just happened in Washington on March 1st, 1954, we had no idea that was happening. And it was like an addendum because the letter was written right before the nationalist attack in Washington in 1954. And they felt the need to kind of just let it be known that they were unaware and that it shouldn't reflect negatively or yo no sé qué. But this was being written in support. 2 other interesting documents, the Hotel Normandy in Viejo San Juan. Apparently that person knew Don Pedro and was very supportive of his cause, and he would stay there. I found a lot of handwritten, ay Dios mío, handwritten, lo que es una carta escrita así a mano, que no existe ya, everybody's on Facebook and texting, and we lost that intimacy of communication, right? He had a lot of handwritten letters, respectfully yours, Pedro Albizu Campos. And he wrote a handwritten letter to Ruth Reynolds, and apparently he had a sense of humor. He wrote it on the torn table of contents of a book on the US Constitution. So he ripped the table of contents off, and that's where he wrote his letter. And over here is where actually he signed it devotedly, Pedro Albizu Campos, yeah. So, I wanted to share this image too. A lot of people hablan de Don Pedro. La primera vez que yo hice un grabado de Don Pedro en el 94. Y mi tía Chávez vino a visitar de Levittown a Brooklyn. Y yo, queriendo mostrar que mira, yo sé algo de Puerto Rico y salgo bien como contentita con el grabado de Don Pedro y le digo, mira Titi Chávez, mira quién pinté. Y ella lo miró y dijo, uy, ese hombre era muy, pero muy malo. Ok, pues yo me crié con como esa vergüenza. Ay, yo soy puertorriqueña, ¿qué representa eso? Y para mucha gente eso es algo malo. Y por fin pude compartir algo con una tía visitando de Puerto Rico, que para mí es ese enlace a esta isla. Yo estando y viviendo en Brooklyn, y así fue que me respondió. Imagínate eso. Pues yo me dediqué como hizo Arturo Schomburg. Arthur Schomburg, considered one of the biggest heroes of black research. There's the Arthur Schomburg Center for Black Research in Harlem, named after this man, born here in Puerto Rico. He once asked a teacher here in Puerto Rico, can you talk to me about black history? And the teacher said, black people have no history. So there are some who hang our heads low and just say, oh shit, there's no, black people have no history. And then there are others, like myself, who say, bump that, I'm going to dedicate my entire life to proving how fabulous these people were. And so look at this photo. It's him surrounded by his grandchildren, unfortunately in a hospital. Okay, these are just, I'm going quickly through some others so you can see older images I did of Don Pedro, where I'm doing the same thing of collaging text. This is called Raising Revolution, and this is about all the the subversives that somehow had been educated or trained in U.S. institutions, like Don Pedro, who was a first lieutenant in the U.S. Army, thanks to the Jones Act of 1917. Okay? And many others. Oscar López Rivera, also a vet. And here is an image. This is a very popular image of Don Pedro in his, I'm not sure if this is his cell or a hospital room, and you can see how destroyed his legs are from this process. And then this is another piece that I reference, and I'm speaking more on Archivos Subversivos, but these are like my files, okay? This is a piece, I call it Al Viso Elevado, and it's a reference, it's like that Christ typography. For those of you who study art, you know, this is so common in Renaissance art, is presenting these Christ-like figures. And so for me, that light that we discussed, right, how it came, how the radiation was fed to him, I'm using that celestial light, you know, playing on the celestial light shining on Christ, but in this case it's the radiation. And then the lyrics are to the song El Todopoderoso, that Hector Lavoe, ay, cómo lo escupieron, cómo lo empujaron, cómo lo llevaron a crucificar. Taking these popular traditions and using them to celebrate our own people. Estas canciones no son solo para bailar salsa. Vienen de una resistencia. Y eso se tiene que conocer y se tiene que mantener y se tiene que ampliar until things are equal, right? It's not that we were sent here to live fighting our whole lives, but we can aspire to that equality. But we can't just do that thinking about each of us individually. Carpeta Julia de Burgos. Who knows who Julia de Burgos is? Hands. ¿Quién es Julia de Burgos? Who is Julia de Burgos? You could shout it out. Okay, let's do this with no shame whatsoever. Who does not know who's Julia de Burgos? Who does not know? Okay. I was going to wear my earrings, Mary, and I left them. ¿A qué hora tengo que terminar? Porque a mí me gusta hablar mucho de estas cosas.
We have to show up on that.
It's
5:45.
5:45 is when the class ends.
This class is at 5:45 and then
Okay,
we'll
so
start at 6.
no, so I want to finish obviously before we discuss. Carpeta Julia de Burgos. Julia de Burgos is probably the most famous poet to have come out of this island, I would say. I would say the most famous. Other people would say probably, because there's other big names, and there's Juan Antonio Correger, and there's Luis Jordan Torres. And a lot of these people were her contemporaries, but because she was the woman, you know, I painted a mural of her in New York City together with Frida Kahlo. And she and Frida Kahlo had one thing in common, many things in common. But one of those things is that Frida Kahlo was painting these small retablos, and all of her male counterparts were painting these big dookie murals. And then if Frida Kahlo called herself a communist, people would say, well, she didn't really have those beliefs. It's just that those were Diego Rivera's beliefs, her husband's, and so by default. So it's something that, unfortunately, in these times, Julia passed in '53. Unfortunately, people allowed this gender question to eclipse how great and how immense they were. When people do study the work of Julia de Burgos, her most famous poem, I would say, is El Rio Grande de Loíza. And she describes this river as this man, as this great lover, the only lover that in touching her body touched her soul. Es una cosa espectacular. But a lot of people tend to focus on her love forlorn poems and ignore these really radical, revolutionary messages that she put out in her poetry. She too was a card-carrying member of the Nationalist Party. Okay? She participated in all of these things. And she was even forced to leave Puerto Rico, where she worked as a school teacher, because she was blacklisted. All right? And this happened before la ley de la Mordaza del 48, donde hablar de la independencia, donde tener una bandera borincana, era ilegal. you could go to jail just for waving. People in New York always ask, why are Puerto Ricans so obsessed with that flag? Why in every Puerto Rican neighborhood they gotta have it on, you know, their windows, on the corderes, on the, como decimos allá, los fire escape, the fire escapes. It's like the poor man's balcony. And I explained it was outlawed. It was illegal. So how do you have this flag be illegal for over 50 years and then give permission to wave it? People are going to wave it to kingdom come. So here in this file that I did, I want to explain. I'm a painter, yes. I work on canvas, yes. For certain pieces, I do away with that to work with materials that I call cultural or political signifiers, right? If this is a project on la carpeta, vamos a trabajar con una carpeta. I went to an office supply store, got a box of file folders, opened them up, and that's where I started painting and collaging. All right, I did another project on Mayaguez about the activists there who I was calling valientes, and what did I do? I painted these on camouflage because I was reclaiming camouflage, not for the US military, but for the true soldiers fighting for a cause, which were the activists fighting for peace and justice for their land and their people. It's back before there were these things. We used typewriters, okay? And all typewriters was one font, and that was called Courier. You could look it up now as Courier. That was our thing back then. And so the days of J. Edgar Hoover, all right? And COINTELPRO, the Counterintelligence Project. Let's meditate on that name. Counterintelligence. Isn't that like a deep name? It's like counterintelligence pro-ignorance. Yeah, very interesting. So, es nuestra la hora. These are the documents I'm finding in el centro de la revista del periódico Claridad. Artículos que se publicaron años atrás con la poesía de Julia de Burgos. Es nuestra la hora. Somos puños cerrados. We are clenched fists. This is really different than like a love poem. This is a different type of love poem. All right? It's hard to see, though it's like a little fuzzy. Empuña el machete y abraza las filas de la independencia. Okay, these are words by Julia de Burgos. Puerto Rico, estado asociado y ridículo. Words of Julia de Burgos. Okay, es nuestra la hora. This is a poem about the campesinos, about the workers. This was published in Claridad and Rio Piedra. Unfortunately, I don't have a date on this document, but it does show here that she published it in 1935, I believe. Y somos puño cerrado. This image that I found of Julia de Burgos was very beautiful to me. It was a very rare image that I hadn't seen before, and I started working with it over and over. But when I painted it, she has this amazing poem called A Julia de Burgos. If anyone knows that poem, and if you're not, you should look it up. It's really deep. She writes a poem to herself, and this is why I also did the mural with con las dos Fridas, because it's like two versions of Frida Kahlo, and she writes a poem where it's two versions of Julia de Burgos. Tú eres sumisa, no, yo no. Oh God, I'm horribly misquoting her, but like another beautiful line. A mí me riza el viento, a mí me pinta el sol. So she's talking about this Julia de Burgos, the socialite, la señora bien señorona, and the real Julia de Burgos es la esencia, who's not afraid of being her truest, most liberated self. So when I painted her using this photo, I tended to paint her using imagery inspired by her poems. She always pushed el jíbaro y el campesino como el gran libertador de Puerto Rico. En este poema, pentacromía, sería un obrero. No, it's actually, I left that line out. But the first line of this stanza is, Hoy quiero ser hombre. She's talking about like this Halloween tradition. Hoy quiero ser hombre, sería un obrero, picando la caña, sudando el jornal. Abrazos arriba, los puños en alto, quitándole al mundo mi parte de pan. And so I wanted to paint her not as like the little girl with the curls and and the skirt, you know? It was like Julia with the machete. Si somos puño cerrado, que ella tenga el puño de ella misma cerrado en un machete. And this is on burlap. Again, it's not canvas, it's burlap. What does burlap or saco represent? Where do you see this tela, saco? ¿A dónde se ve eso? Please give me a real good answer, because if we were in New York, somebody would tell me Starbucks, and I'd like faint. So, okay, cuando empacan como diferentes productos agrícolas, no como arroz, papas, café, ¿verdad? En Colombia, mi esposo es colombiano y en Colombia se ven todos los jíbaros bajando del monte por las tardes con su buey o con su burro y una bolsa de saco con yuca, con cualquier cosecha que acaban de picar. Okay, so I paint on burlap. Another thing I do here and in Archivos, I don't paint in color because it's for me a symbol of the declining agricultural production in Puerto Rico. O sea, cuando uno está sembrando y cosechando, las cosas son verdes. Cuando la tierra está seca, se ve así. Earth tones. Okay? This is another cool thing I found in the files in El Centro. This is a flyer from June 1940 in New York. And on this program, we had different really well-known names like Recitaciones Poéticas por la gran poetisa, I guess, de Puerto Rico, Julia de Burgos. And then we have Vito Marcantonio, who was a congressman and also very supportive of Puerto Rican independence and Pedro Albizu Campos' case. And here, as the maestro de ceremonia, Jesus Colón, which brings me to my next subversivo. And the coolest part, entrada general, 25 centavos. These are like these grand balls, you know, that the Puerto Rican community would have, and so